why some men are unforgettable and most are interchangeable. There are two kinds of men that women talk about years after the relationship has ended. The first kind gets talked about with a particular quality of feeling that time does not seem to dilute, the kind of memory that surfaces unbidden, that still carries a specific weight even when everything else about that period of life has faded into general impression. The second kind gets talked about in aggregate. He was nice. He was fine. There were a few of them, actually, around that same period, and the details have blurred together because there was nothing sharp, enough about any of them to stay separate in the memory. He was not a bad man. He was not even an unremarkable man by most external measures. He was simply interchangeable, a category rather than a person, and categories do not get remembered the way individuals do. What you need to understand, and what almost nobody will tell you directly, is that the difference between these two kinds of men is not what most people assume it to be. Most men, when they think about what makes someone unforgettable, reach for the obvious explanations: looks, status, charisma in the loud, room-filling sense of the word, certain kind of social dominance that announces itself immediately and commands attention without asking for it. These things are not irrelevant. A man who is genuinely attractive and genuinely accomplished and genuinely socially fluent has real advantages, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But they are neither sufficient nor necessary for the quality of presence that actually carves itself into another person's memory and stays there. You have met physically unremarkable men who are impossible to forget. You have met objectively impressive men who left almost no trace. The variable that actually determines which category a man falls into is not on any of the lists that get passed around in conversations about what makes men attractive. It is something quieter and more fundamental and considerably more difficult to manufacture. The men who are genuinely unforgettable share a quality that is almost paradoxical when you first encounter it. They are not trying to be remembered. In fact, they seem almost indifferent to the question of whether they are making an impression, not in the performed way of a man who has decided that seeming indifferent is a strategy, but in the genuine way of a man whose attention is so fully occupied by the actual world in front of him that the management of his own image simply does not have a place in the room. This quality, this total absorption in the genuine rather than the performed, is what creates the specific texture of an unforgettable interaction. The person across from him does not remember the interaction because it was impressive. They remember it because it was real, and real, in a world full of curated presentations, is one of the rarest things one person can offer another. This chapter is going to show you precisely what separates the men who leave a permanent mark from the men who leave a pleasant but transient one, why the qualities most men develop in pursuit of memorability are exactly the qualities that produce interchangeability, and what it actually takes to become the kind of man who occupies a permanent, specific, irreplaceable space in the minds of the people who encounter him. Begin with the concept of specificity, because specificity is where this whole conversation lives. What makes a person unforgettable is never their general quality. It is their particular quality, the specific texture of how they see the world, the specific things that move them and the specific things they refuse to pretend to care about, the specific way they respond to ideas and to people and to moments of genuine feeling. Generality is comfortable and safe and produces nothing worth remembering. A man who has smoothed himself into a broadly agreeable shape, who has sanded down his edges and his opinions and his peculiarities in service of being more universally palatable, has also, in the same motion, made himself impossible to distinguish from every other man who made the same trade. He is pleasant, he is easy to be around, he will not offend anyone, he will also not stay in anyone's mind past the conversation, because there was nothing specific enough about him to anchor to. Think about the men in your own life who have left the deepest impression on you, not necessarily the most successful or the most conventionally admirable, but the ones who actually change the texture of your thinking or your feeling about something, the ones you still quote, still reference, still measure certain experiences against years later. What they almost certainly have in common is not a list of impressive attributes. What they have in common is that you always knew exactly where they stood. They had genuine positions on things that mattered to them, and they held those positions with a kind of relaxed certainty that did not require your agreement to remain. Intact, they were interested in specific things deeply enough that their interest was contagious. They had a way of seeing that was theirs, distinctly and recognizably, so that when something reminded you of them, it reminded you of them specifically and not of a general category of thoughtful or interesting men. This is the thing most men get backwards in the effort to be more attractive, more impressive, more widely appealing. They move toward generality. They broaden their interests to signal range. They moderate their opinions to signal maturity. They become agreeable in the specific sense of never creating friction, never holding a position that might cost them approval, never being so distinctly themselves that someone might find them too much. The result is a man who is easy to like and impossible to love, easy to spend time with and impossible to miss, pleasant to be around and genuinely interchangeable with. Every other man who made the same calculations, the very moves that were supposed to make him more desirable have made him less memorable, and less memorable in the economy of human connection is very close to invisible. The misconception at the center of this is that memorability is about impact, about doing or saying something so impressive that it brands itself into the other person's consciousness. This leads men toward performance, toward the big gesture, the striking statement, the carefully constructed moment of apparent depth or wit or passion, and performance, however skillfully executed, always reads as performance. The human nervous system has extraordinary sensitivity to the difference between a man who is genuinely moved by something and a man who is demonstrating that he is the kind of man who gets moved by things. The first creates connection. The second creates the slightly uneasy feeling of watching someone act. And what people remember about watching someone act is rarely the performance itself. It is the slight distance they felt from it. The reframe that changes everything is this. Memorability is not something you create in other people. It is something that happens in other people as a consequence of you being genuinely, specifically, unapologetically yourself in their presence. A man who has actual convictions that he holds, independent of whether they are approved of, is specific. A man who has genuine passions that he pursues independent of whether they are impressive is specific. A man who responds to the actual texture of the moment in front of him rather than to the idea of how a confident, desirable man would respond to such a moment is specific, and specific men cannot be aggregated into a category. They can only be remembered as themselves. You need to look honestly at the places in your life where you have traded specificity for palatability, the opinions you have softened because they created friction, the interests you have understated because they seemed niche or eccentric or insufficiently impressive, the things that genuinely move you that you've kept quiet about because vulnerability of that particular kind felt like a risk. Every one of these trades was a trade of memorability for safety, and while safety is understandable, it comes with a cost that compounds quietly over years. The man who never risks being too much also never risks being unforgettable. He occupies the comfortable middle, ground where most men live and where almost no one goes, looking when they are trying to find someone worth choosing. The practice that begins to shift this is not about manufacturing distinctiveness. It is about recovering it. Start by identifying 3 things you genuinely care about that you have been underplaying in your interactions with people you want to impress. Not things you think you should care about, things you actually do. Then, in your next significant conversation, let those things be present without managing how they land. If the topic comes up naturally, hold your actual position rather than the moderated version. If it does not come up naturally, introduce it, not as a performance of depth, as the actual content of your mind offered without apology. Notice what happens. Notice how different it feels to be in a conversation where you're not monitoring the gap between what you think and what you say. Notice how the other person responds to contact with something genuine versus contact with something managed. The difference is palpable, and once you feel it from the inside, the managed version will begin to feel as thin as it actually is. What accumulates over time through the consistent practice of being specifically yourself rather than a broadly agreeable version of what you think the room wants is a quality of presence that other people cannot fully explain but cannot ignore. They find themselves thinking about the conversation afterward in a way they do not think about most conversations. They find themselves wanting to return to it, wanting to continue it, wanting more time in the particular atmosphere of being around someone who actually has a self that is legibly present. This is not charisma in the performed sense. It is something older and more fundamental. It is the simple and radical act of being a distinct human being in a world full of men who have spent years trying to become whatever the room seem to want. That distinctness is what gets remembered. That distinctness is, in the end, the only thing that does. The men who stay in people's minds long after the room is emptied are not the ones who tried hardest to leave an impression. They are the ones who were so genuinely occupied with the actual texture of their own experience, their own convictions, their own way of moving through the world, that the impression was simply a byproduct. You cannot engineer that quality from the outside in. You cannot study what unforgettable men do and replicate the behaviors and arrive at the same result, because the behaviors are not the point. They are the exhaust of an interior condition. The condition is what you are actually trying to build. That condition is not mystery or aloofness or the performance of not caring. It is something much simpler and much more demanding. It is the decision to be so fully occupied with being yourself, the actual specific irreducible version of yourself and not the edited one, that the question of whether you are making an impression simply does not have room in you, not because you don't care about connection, but because you understand that genuine connection only happens between two specific people, and you cannot be one of those people if you have spent the evening being a generalized version of what you thought the other person wanted to find. Most men will spend their lives being forgettable and never understand why. They will follow every reasonable piece of advice. They will work on their appearance and their status and their social skills and their conversational range. They will become objectively more impressive and remain mysteriously interchangeable, because they will have spent all that energy making themselves more generally appealing and none of it making themselves more specifically themselves. And generally appealing men blur together in the memory the way pleasant landscapes do, beautiful in the moment, indistinct in the recollection. You do not become unforgettable by becoming more. You become unforgettable by becoming more precisely who you already are, before the editing, before the palatability, calculations, before the long project of making yourself acceptable enough to be chosen. The man worth remembering was always already there. He was, just waiting for you to stop apologizing for him.